Hey guys, kinggath here with Bethesda Mod School. In this lesson, we're going to dive into scenes for the first time. Now, scenes are super powerful. They generally are used for dialogue to make NPCs talk, but they can also be used for player talking to NPCs and having choices. They can be used just to make NPCs travel somewhere, so you can just give them kind of AI commands with scenes. You can do something as complicated as the cutscene system we did for Conqueror, where certain sequences where the game locks you out and basically plays what appears to be a cutscene. You can do really complicated, cool stuff with the scenes. You can even have just those random conversations between two NPCs where the player's not even involved. There's tons of ways to use scenes. So, saying all that, we're not going to cover all that today. I'm going to start with the simple thing and something I think that will be most useful to a lot of people, and that is the player dialogue. That is, you walk up to an NPC and talk to them, and at some point you have an option of a dialogue choice. I think that's the most universally useful type of scene, the one that will get the most mileage. So if I take a break from the dialogue part of this mod school series for a while, that you guys will have most of your needs covered up till this point just by going through the previous dialogue videos. So another thing we're going to be touching on is the voice file reference tool 2, which I did in another Bethesda Mod School video for independently, because some people will just want to learn about that tool without learning about scenes. So if you haven't watched that already, you're going to want to do so, because I am going to use that tool, and I'm not going to necessarily fully explain what I'm doing or how to install that tool. That's in its own video. So I'm using a copy of the previous dialogue mod we've been using, the KG Diag whatever, and so we've already got our NPC configured. And if you don't know about this or how I set that up, because there was a very important point in that video about NPC persistence and how you have to set that up, make sure you watch that. It's the Dialogue 101 video in this series. And then you should be good to go to continue with this guide. So what we're going to do here is we're going to open up our quest. And the first thing we need to do for any scene is that any NPCs we want involved need to be in an alias. Now, we've touched on aliases in the quest building part of the Bethesda Mod School series, but if you haven't been going through the quest building, you're not going to be familiar with this. So I'm going to just briefly explain what this is as I'm doing it, but I'm not going to get too deep into this, because alias is another part of the creation kit that's very complex if you dive too much into it. So it's going to be much better if you just focus on the little pieces I'm showing you, and then you'll learn more as we go in coming videos. So we're going to start by right-clicking here and hitting New Reference Alias. And we are going to wait for the screen to load. This is one of the slowest screens in the CK, unfortunately. But we're going to go ahead and give it a name. You always have to give it a name. And we're just going to name it Gath, because I think that's what we called our NPC. Let's see here. What's his full name in here? NPC, another nice slow screen. Yep, just called Gath. Perfect. And then we're going to choose Unique Actor, because we did make that. Oh, I hope we did. Hope we made this character unique. Let's see here. Essentially unique. Good. If you don't choose the unique flag and it's just a general NPC that can be plopped into the world multiple times, you're going to instead want to do specific reference and then actually load up the game cell and then you'll get an option to select them. And I'm sure I'll show that at some point if I haven't in the quest, or I'm positive I've shown it in the quest building. So if you're interested in how to select a specific reference because you're not using a unique actor for what you're doing, go check out my quest building series. That's going to be real helpful for you. So we're going to go ahead and find our NPC by just starting to type in the editor ID, and that's this unique identifier you had to give the form. So you can actually, any drop down in the CK, you can just start typing the letters and it will find that particular thing alphabetically. So we found our NPC there, and the rest of this we're going to just leave alone, and we'll hit OK here. So now we've got our alias, and all an alias is essentially a variable that's pointing to something. So their variable is Gath. It's pointing to this particular actor wherever they happen to be in the world. And the reason that you do this is that if you think about something like the settlers who can talk in workshop mode and have shopkeeper dialogue, you wouldn't want to have to create a new quest for every single potential settler. You want to be able to reuse the same dialogue quest each time, and so you just set up an alias, which just is basically settler here, and then it doesn't matter who's inside of it. So then you are operating on the alias as opposed to the actual NPC. So that's effectively how aliases are working in this case. You guys will have gotten many metaphors out of me if you followed the quest building toolkit. I'm still trying to piece together the best way to explain aliases, because they're kind of a thick topic, and I'm sure there's a million different ways to get through to people what they actually do and mean. But I think if you just think about it as this just could be any NPC, whatever the fill type may be. So knowing that, if we go into the Scenes tab, what we want to do here is add our actor into a scene. So the first thing we have to do is create a scene. Now this screen is just very confusing to look at first, and it would be, I could imagine anybody trying to learn this on their own would have no idea what to do. So what you actually have to do is first create a scene, and you do that up in this section up here. So you right click over here and hit new, and then you're going to be asked to create a scene ID. So just like almost everything else in the creation kit, it's got to be fully unique. We're going to just call this demo scene. We'll call it demo player dialogue scene, because I might end up doing some more in the same exact mod file where I add more scenes for some of the other types of scenes I described to you at the beginning of the video. So once you create that, you actually have to select it. So you won't actually be in the scene. So when you actually, after you hit create, it deselects. So you could try and do something and it wouldn't seem like it's working. It's because you got to select the scene again immediately. So the first thing we want to do here is, and I'll describe all this stuff in a bit, but right now, for the most part, you're not going to need a lot of things from here. There's a couple things you might need later on, but I think for what we're trying to do, you're not going to need anything from up here, with the exception of player dialogue, obviously, because we're trying to show player dialogue. So the first thing you'll end up doing in a scene is hit new actor, and then you're going to select the actors you want. Now, you might be tempted to add player default. That is almost never necessary. The one exception is if you're trying to force the player to say a particular thing. So I'm sure you guys have seen this occasionally in the game where your character will just respond with something without you having any interaction. And to do that, you use player default. You basically treat them just like any other NPC. But you select all of your aliases here that you want to add. In our case, we're just going to add Gath, and we're going to hit OK. And you'll see a new line appear for each one. Now, I am going to add the player default just so you can see what it might look like if you were to add multiple NPCs, but each one will just have their own little line. And then this is going to extend as we start playing around with this and adding more stuff. So the way these scenes work is they're broken up into chunks. So if we right-click here and we hit Add Phase at End. So a phase basically means it could be the NPC talking. It could be the NPC running an AI package. It could be a timer running. It could be a script running. Phases basically are just chunks of the conversation. So one chunk might be the NPC greeting you and saying, hey, how's it going? Then the next phase might be you getting a chance to respond. So it's basically just a way of thinking about chunking out the conversation into, one person speaks, or like if you thought about this, we're going to have a conversation where you have no player input. And you're just going to have Gath speak, then the player speak, then Gath speak. Each time it changes who's speaking, you would switch phases. So phase is just a way to break up a conversation. It's really useful for a variety of things. For example, when we start talking about quests, maybe you want to have a certain point where the NPC gives you the reward. You don't want to have to wait till the end of the quest. You want it to happen at the point where the character says something like, here you go, here's your reward. And you want it to trigger right then. Well, one of the nice things is that at every phase point, you have an opportunity to do anything. You can run a script or set a quest stage. You can do whatever you need to do. And so breaking things up into phases also opens up more opportunities for that sort of thing. So phases are just a piece of a conversation. So it'll take a little while to click with that, but I think once you start seeing some examples, the way conversations are broken up actually makes a lot of sense, just from a real life perspective, especially when you start thinking about, okay, how could I gamify this? So I think it's a very well done scene. I actually really like the scene system. It's a little hard to wrap your head around at first. So don't get overwhelmed by all these different options. Just keep following my tutorial series. I promise you I'll eventually get to all of the ones that are useful. There are some that aren't particularly useful or that just outright don't work because they're likely inherited from an older game and they just didn't get removed from the creation kit for Fallout 4. So the next thing we're going to do for this particular demonstration, because our goal is to show you player dialogue, is we're going to explicitly check in player dialogue. And what this ends up doing is it adds a greeting phase, so a start phase greeting. This is actually an interesting little thing. So from a technical standpoint, this isn't actually a phase. It's kind of weird how this is set up. This is just helping you visualize things. In reality, when you set up a greeting, it actually exists over here on the miscellaneous tab, and the greeting is set to start a phase. And I'll show you that in a moment, but just that can be relevant for those of you guys who have no idea what I'm talking about, scenes and stuff. Don't worry about that. That was kind of a high level thing for people who there are some number of the viewers of this who are experienced mod authors who just watch my stuff just to see if I happen to be revealing any secret. I know I do the same thing. I watch everybody's tutorials because I'm just like, who knows what, because a lot of this information was gleaned just from experimentation. Not all of this is documented documented. So a lot of us have just figured out different stuff by playing around. So I think for people who have been doing scenes for a while, they might not have understood how that was configured in the background. So the next thing we're going to do is remove this player default. We don't need it. I was just showing you it as an example to explain what this would look like once we started adding phases, that all of a character's stuff is kept within the white box and it kind of spans across phases. And we don't actually want player default, because the way player dialogue lines work, you'll see in a moment, actually can exist within the white box of the NPC that's talking. And you'll understand that in a second. So if we want to remove a character, you right click on their area and you hit remove here. It'll confirm it. If you had any stuff set up for them, so if you had anything, they're called actions, and you'll see those in a second. If you had any dialogue or anything set up for them in the scene, it'll all get removed. And if it were dialogue that wasn't set up anywhere else, it would be lost. So keep that in mind. Now, it doesn't delete your files, but those files will be named something that will no longer make any sense. And if you followed my earlier dialogue tutorials, you'll know what I'm talking about. I showed you where to find those file names, and so that's kind of relevant. Be careful when you're removing things that you have any of which file names those were, because it could be very difficult to find them otherwise, since the sound files are just named with hex IDs. They're not named with anything that's in the content of the sound file. So we're going to remove that actor there. All right, so now this is what you would generally have done. You wouldn't have added the player. Again, just doing that so you guys can get a feel for scenes a little bit. So the next thing we're going to do here is set up our greeting. So our greeting would just be the thing the NPC says to start the conversation up. Now, there are occasions where you might not want the NPC to say anything. Maybe you want the player to say the first thing, and that's possible to do, but it's a little more complicated and tricky to set up, so we're not going to do that for now. So just assume from this point until you get into further tutorials that you have to make the NPC say something to start a conversation. And I will eventually show you how to get past that, but for now, we're just going to make it a requirement. So the first thing that will happen when you try to set up a greeting on any new quest is there won't be a greeting topic yet. And I showed you guys topics in the other dialogue tutorials. I think I showed it in the first and third tutorials, that they're just basically those things like hello, idle. They're just groups of types of speech, and it's just a way to keep things organized. So for when you go to create a greeting topic, you do need to give it an ID. So we're just going to call this greetings, and you'd have to do this once for every quest. So now we've got our greetings topic, and then it's going to come up and ask you to type what it is that the NPC is going to say. Now we're going to do all these steps at once. I'm actually going to set the anim face archetype and actually record the file right now, since we're just doing this live. So I'm going to just keep this real simple. Let's see, we'll just go, hey, I'm trying to think of a generic term because I can't say hey sir because I don't know which character I'm going to be operating on. If you want to do gender tagging and things, like if you want to be able to say hey sir or hey ma'am, things like that, you can do that. There are dialogue conditioning for the sex of the player character, so that can be possible. It's just, again, too complicated for this early in the series, but I will show you that eventually because it can make the characters seem a little more immersive to do stuff like that. So I'll just go, hey, how's it going? Here we go. And then we'll just change this to friendly, and then we're going to select here, and we're going to hit record. Hey, how's it going? Hey, how's it going? We'll save that. And that's, excuse me, I mentioned it in the very first dialogue tutorial, is that when you record stuff in the CK, it's terrible. It ends up having sound gaps in it. It'll catch the click of your mouse. Not ideal at all. At some point, I am going to do a tutorial on Audacity to show you guys how to record in there and clean up audio. It's pretty self-explanatory piece of software to use, and you can find tons of tutorials, but I'll do just a basic one just to show you guys some real basic noise removal and whatnot. But for now, this is what we're using just to quickly get this up and running. And you generally will want to do this when you're setting up, because if you don't have some sort of sound file in there, it screws up the way the camera works, and it makes it take forever to proceed through dialogue. So I always recommend, even if you're not going to use the final sound files, whenever you're doing quest work, it makes a lot of sense to just get some audio in there right away to make testing a lot more realistic and easy. So after you hit OK on that first screen, you get to your topic info screen. And this is the reason that there's these two screens. This is something I explained in Dialogue 101, but I'm going to go over it again because it's very confusing to me. And it's still, I get it now, but it was very confusing to me. The reason that you end up with those two different screens, because it seems to me when I first started, it was like, why not just have it all in here, is because sometimes you're going to want the NPC to say a lot of words, and you might want them to use different facial animations. So maybe you want them to say, maybe the next sentence I say is like, wait a second, aren't you the guy that stole from me? And then I'd want my face to be angry instead. Maybe I want to play a different animation during them. But I still want them all in the same phase. And I told you that the conversation's broken into phases where it's the NPC or the player or whoever, does their things, they speak, etc. You can have it all speak. I can add additional responses here. So in fact, we'll just do that exactly. Aren't you the guy that stole my wrench? And we'll make it angry. Wait a second. Oh yeah, I want to do, hey, let's say I already said, hey. I'm not a writer. Here we go. Wait a second. Aren't you the guy that stole my wrench? I guess, and then we got a pronoun problem there. It could be, weren't you the guy or the gal? Aren't you the one that stole my wrench? Here we go. So then we'll record this. Wait a second. Aren't you the one that stole my wrench? Oh, I forgot to hit record. Now you guys can hear me do it again. This is one I don't envy the voice actors when we stick them in the CK occasionally and ask them to do this for us. All right, let's try this again. Wait a second, aren't you the one who stole my wrench? Wait a second, aren't you the one who stole my wrench? There we go. Close that, hit OK. All right, so as you can see, each of those responses happen one after the other. And then I mentioned that you might want to change the animation like we did, the facial animation. Another reason is if you saw up at the top here, there's this counter. And the goal with that is to keep the text within a chunk that's reasonable for people to read. I also think they came up with that length based on how much screen real estate there is especially when you consider that this will have to be, or at least from Bethesda's perspective, this would have to be translated into a lot of languages, and some languages' words are going to be longer than others. And so I think the 150 they came up with was like, this would cover, all the languages we translate our games into and wouldn't be too much to read on the screen at any given time. It's not a hard rule, but either way, I find it useful to break things up into kind of thoughts, like break up things into natural sentences and stuff, and I'd rather have multiple response text entries in here, just to keep it a little more organized. Another thing you can do with this is then you can individually remove chunks of the scene here. So if I want to just remove part of the line, I can just do it here. I could just select this and delete this and keep this. You can also reorganize them with your left and right arrow keys when they're selected. So that can sometimes be useful. So there's a lot of power in having these secondary records here. So now, going back to the way the greeting works, I mentioned when we started that this is kind of a fake thing. This phase doesn't really exist. What's actually happening here is it's going to this start scene here. So you'll see that it's pointing to demo player dialogue scene, which is the name we gave our scene over here. So what it's happening is when you go to create a greeting here, it's basically just setting up a hello that points to a scene and starts it. That's all it is. And then so this is just, and then it finally goes to this screen. This screen, I think I showed in the Dialog 103 tutorial, or a version of this screen. This is where you could set up, like where you could condition this. You could set up, you could group these together. You could do the info grouping. You could set conditions on them. So maybe the greeting changes depending on the scenario and whatnot. That's all this is. But we're going to hit OK there. So if I were to say, for example, just as a demonstration, again, this is one of those advanced things for people who are coming and watching this. If I change this to none, you'll see that this actually disappears, but it's not gone. It's just moved into the greetings. So the only thing that determines which scene it appears on is which scene it's starting, and then it gets moved in the scene screen to that greeting section. So that's an interesting little thing that once I learned that, it made a lot more sense of this. So that's why I'm showing you guys, even though most of you don't care or need to know that. All right, so now we're going to have the player need to respond to that. So the next thing we do, and you'll see, this is where you'll see what I was talking about, where we don't actually need the player as their own, they don't need their own section here. So if we right click here and hit new action, now this is the first time you're seeing the action thing. So what I was mentioning when I talked about what phases were, a phase can hold any number of actions. You can have as many of these as you want. I think the exception is I think you have to choose one of these three dialogue types. So you can have one dialogue, one NPC response, or one player dialogue. You can't have all three, but you could have dialogue, a AI package, and I think radio is actually included as considered a dialogue type too. You could also have a timer. You could also trigger it to start some other scene. So you can have a lot of different stuff happening in a single phase. The most common way to use this, though, is you would have some sort of speaking thing happening. and a package, or you would have just the package or just the timer. It's rare that you're going to mix more than just package plus dialogue. Usually, you want the NPC, maybe they're walking and talking, or you want to give them a pack. Like there's even AI packages to just say, hey, look at somebody, or turn toward them, or stay still. Like there's a lot of different AI uses for AI packages. Now we haven't covered those, I don't think, in any of my guides. That's another immensely deep topic that I want to get into because it's really powerful. And once you understand it, it really just opens up the doors and you start to understand how a lot more of this game engine works. But for now, we're going to skip it. If you guys walked through my Dialogue 101 tutorial, which I hope you did if you're here, the NPC that I have set up doesn't have any AI packages, so we don't have to worry about him wandering off during this conversation. So we're going to choose player dialogue as our type. And I will show you a dialogue type as well on the next phase. But first, we're going to set up player dialogue. Now, when this first comes up, you think, oh, this is no big deal. This is just like the same screen I've always seen. But this is just one little piece of it. A player dialogue is a lot, because if you think about what happens in the game, you get 4 options, and then the NPC will respond differently depending on what you select. So this is just one of 8 screens we're about to have to set up. So that's relevant to know, that don't get your hopes up by that it's being this easy, because obviously we got to set up the 4 player lines and the 4 NPC responses. So I'm going to just hit OK to this, but if you were to just start setting up in here, this is what would be the player's positive response, or if you're on Xbox, it would be the A button. I don't know what the dialogue buttons are on the keyboard for PC. I've literally never played this game without a controller and done dialogue scenes. I've played it with the controller for other things, without a controller for other things, but in general, anytime I'm playing the game for real with questing, I'm always playing with a controller. So we're going to hit OK, and then you're going to get this screen. This is what we're actually going to set up. Now, we're about to get into territory where how you do this is kind of up to you, because there are a lot of different schools of thought on it. Now, I am of the school of thought that you should make it always feel like it belongs in the base game. And so our team, when we do mods, always does player dialogue, and we always do choices that are mapped to the appropriate types, because we want to follow the pattern that players are used to. So the way this generally is that positive responses are always mapped to one key, negative to another, because often you'll find, and I know why they did this, and it's because a lot of players who don't care about the RPG aspect will spam through something, and they can quickly learn that, oh, as long as I spam A, I'm going to be a nice guy and I'm going to accept the quest. Whereas if spamming B is like, I don't like this person, I just want them to stop. And so you'll get, it's basically by doing that, you allow those players who are there more for the shooting gameplay than the quest gameplay to be able to continue to play as they are used to, and without throwing any loops in for them. Same thing, I think, with the question response. That tends to always be, if you're on the controller, it's always the Y response, and then neutral tends to be kind of the wild card. It's often used as sarcasm. Sometimes it's used for additional questions, things like that. So I love to always follow that, and I always like to include actual player lines. So there are some other ways you could go about this. One is just using text. If you're going to go that route, if you're just going to have the player just say a line but not actually speak it, I would highly recommend you just include a little bit of silence for each of the sound files, and then that way you don't have that long, awkward pause where the NPC doesn't say anything. I would also recommend that you put as much of the information as possible in the little select option, and I'll show you what I'm talking about that in a second. Actually, I should give you an example so you know what I'm talking about before we proceed. So if we go in here, so the prompt, that's what I'm at the select. So if you think about that dialogue wheel when it's on screen, and hopefully, Galdavant, if you think to do this, could you put up a little example of it, a little image up on here? Galdavant is our a wonderful editor who does these Bethesda Mod School videos for me every week. But excuse me, if you could imagine that little dialogue wheel, the words that you see rarely match up with what the NPCs or what the player says in the base game, and that is done through this. The prompt is what will show up next to the button, and the response text is what the player actually says. So this is what will come up in the subtitles if they have it up, whatever you type in here, and then obviously the voice actor read what was in the response text. So I would recommend, if you're going to go with silent protagonist, to put a lot in the prompt, but I don't think this 80 is a hard limit, but I think there's probably is a hard limit in there where you get to a point where it just clips. I haven't tried because I tend to just love the succinct prompts. I'm actually one of the people who's a fan of the Fallout 4 dialogue system. I think it's nice to get a surprise about what my character's going to say. There are some unfortunate times where Bethesda did a poor job with the prompts and you say something a little awkward or that doesn't feel right. But I happen to love that system, so I tend to follow it. But if you want to try that of putting longer lines in here, you can absolutely try that. So I would recommend, again, adding a little bit of silence in the player voice lines and putting more in the prompt if you're going to go that way. Now, another question that comes up that you have to think about how you want to handle is, do you want to have always 4 options? Again, from my perspective, the way my team operates, we always include all 4 just because, again, we want it to fit in with the base game. I can't think of a single instance where Bethesda left options out. I could be wrong. Somebody could prove me wrong. Maybe there are a few cases. I don't think they would do that. I think if any are in there, they slipped in like under the radar. I think somebody in their management department missed it. So if you want to get rid of an option, you want to skip it, there are two ways you can go about this. And the first way is the way we will do it. And that's that if we don't have a lot of viable options for the player to speak a particular thing, we go with the generally positive or generally negative option, where it'll just be, we'll just pick a player line that's like, where they just say, yeah, okay, or that sounds good, or nah, I don't think so. And then we might end up with kind of 2 options that are generally negative and 2 that are generally positive, so that it's real simple. Or sometimes even all 4 will just be generally positive or generally negative, depending on how important it is. But usually, if we get to a point where there's no reason for any choice, we'll just make the player say a line instead. But if we only had really 2 branches we need to follow, one of the cheats is to just have 2 do one thing and 2 do the other. But I've seen other mods do it where instead they'll just have 2 active responses and the other 2 will just be blank. Well, one of the reasons that why I don't like to do this is that those buttons will still show up for the player. And so then it just feels broken. So I would recommend for one of the first 3 methods I mentioned. So either use full player dialogue, do it like Bethesda does. 2, go silent protagonist and fill out all 4 options. Or 3, just do, some number of options where they just are false choices, where it's just kind of like basically the same, maybe question and positive are virtually identical or actually identical. Those are the 3 methods I prefer, but I have seen people do where they just delete them, and you can literally just select it here and hit the delete key on your keyboard and it'll remove that option, and then you don't have to fill anything out for it. So all that stuff about, how you want to go about this out of the way. Well, let's do it the way I like to do it, which is to do full lines. So right here, this is where we get into the voice file reference tool. So voice file reference tool, if you're not familiar with it, I just did a video on it. Should have released right before this one. Go watch it. And it's Tools 102. And it basically is a way for you to listen to and extract the audio files for the player in one shot. So you tend to need to use this for research when you're writing, because if you're going to go with voiced player, because you're going to need to make sure that any lines you type up, the player actually speaks them. Now, this is another one of those things where you can go about it however you want. One of the things you might do is say fill these in with the general idea of what you're going for, and then go search later for dialogue, which is what we're going to do right now. I'm just going to start typing in generally what I want it to do so that I can finish recording and setting up all this work, and then we're going to go into voice file reference tool and do all that. So for positive response, we'll just say yes, I'm sorry. And so we're basically going to go look for a line that would work for that. So I'm going to leave this empty response or the response text blank for now. We'll come back to it until I find the actual line. Let's see. So yes, I'm sorry. Negative. We'll say get bent. That's what our player is going to say. I don't know. I doubt the player says that, but neutral will be like, let's see. We'll do a sarcastic. And then for our question, we'll say, what are you talking about? Which that probably is an actual player line. What are you talking about? All right, so that's what generally what our player is gonna say, and then we can respond with whatever we want now because we're back to the NPC. Now note that it does offer you to fill in the prompt for the NPC. You never have to do that. It doesn't do anything. So I just skip that. So we're gonna go back into this response text to fill this out. And so our positive, be like, let's see, how are we gonna respond to if they say, I'm sorry? Well, that's all right. Can I have it back? So what are we going to use for our face here? We're going to say disbelief. Can't believe somebody just admitted to it and apologized. All right, so we're going to select our line here, hit record. Well, that's all right. Can I have it back? Yeah, we'll save that. I'm not going to play it back again. You guys have heard enough of me saying it. You don't need to hear me play it back. Hit OK there. So then there's that. Then we need to respond to get bent. Then we'll say something in response to that. If I had my wrench, I'd teach you some manners. I'm going to play like Captain America here. Let's see. And then, okay, so right now we have, this will come up occasionally. Sometimes when you go to set this up, you'll see that it has all the different voice files available here, except the one that you actually want, which I don't know why this happens. But when this happens, I just hit OK. Open it back up, and usually when I come back in, it will correctly show. Oh, not today. It's not going to show my thing. So we're going to hit OK. We're going to hit OK again, and then we're going to save our file. I'm going to try popping back in. So this is one of the things when you hear about the creation kit being buggy. This is one of those examples of just like where occasionally it just like seems to lose track of who it is actually speaking. There it goes. So after we hit OK and closed it out, now I can correctly find my voice type and record the line for it. So if I had my wrench, I'd teach you some manners. All right, we'll save that. Hit OK. All right, what's our next one? Neutral. I think this was a sarcastic. So let's see here. Let's see. Sarcasm, eh? How do we want to respond to that? I'll come back to this one. I have nothing's coming to mind. We'll think of something there. All right, and then our question response. Let's see. That wrench you have looks exactly like the one I lost this morning. Here we go. And then what are we going to use? We're going to do confident. We're confident it looks like that. Some of these anim face archetypes, by the way, you'll probably want to just experiment with them at some point. Just experiment with, like, put in a line for a character with every one so you can learn kind of what they do. They have to, you know, they're trying to instill a certain vibe from the character, but some of them aren't quite what you expect. Some of them work for multiple scenarios, you know, beyond just what it says. Like it doesn't necessarily reflect a mood or it's hard to explain, but I think it's worth taking the time if you're going to do a lot of quest design to take the time and do a demonstration for yourself of each one, just so you can kind of see and get a feel for how they faces look during each of those, and you'll get a feel for it. So I actually wish I'd have, when I first did that, put it all together, which was probably 2 years ago now, that I actually had a video of it for you guys. And someone might have a video like that on YouTube. That'd be actually really helpful. All right, let's record here. That wrench you have looks exactly like the one I lost this morning. There we go. And then we got to go back to our sarcastic response. I'll wait to decide on that until I have my actual player response. So we'll come back and I'll show you guys how to come back in here and edit that, because it's a useful skill to have. But now we're going to add another phase here, add phase at end. And to do these types of things, it really, where you click in the screen is really important. So if you want to add a new actor or a phase, you have to click out in this white part. If you want to add an action, you have to be within the phase boundaries of where you want to add it. And you right click and hit new action. So just keep that in mind if you're having trouble adding certain things. And then for phases themselves, yeah, okay, you can right click on it. You can open up the phase and do stuff. We'll cover that stuff later. And there's also a thing you might have saw called split phase. That's really useful, but again, another tutorial. So I'm going to show you guys as well a follow-up dialogue here. So because I don't think I've shown this yet at all, but just this dialogue action, basically what this is just the same as one of these types of boxes. It's as similar as to the greeting screen or any of the screens I showed in the other tutorials for the miscellaneous dialogue. But basically it's just the response screen where you are going to be setting up what they say no matter what. So in this case, we're going to say, you know what? Forget it. I have another right here. Oops. And we're going to use thinking. All right, so we're going to go, you know what? Forget it. I have another one right here. I just realized I forgot a word here. Forget it. And hit OK. and OK again. There we go. So basically for setting up lines where just the NPC is talking. So no matter what the player chooses, the NPC is going to respond to them in one way, and then it's just going to go right to this line. Now, if you wanted the NPC to say more in regards, on that in that particular response, you can just keep adding more lines on this screen, on this topic info. You can just keep adding more, just like we did where I showed you for this greeting. Where we have multiple lines there. Speaking of which, this is a really bad way to do things in your greetings, to have multiple lines, and you'll understand why in a few more tutorials once we start getting into AI packages. But generally, I will say with greetings, you want to keep them as short as possible. And I'm not going to go into it any further than that. But yeah, you could just set up multiple lines if you wanted to on each of these particular actions. Another thing you can do is it is possible to jump around the dialogue. So say maybe if you say one thing, you want it to go over skip a line or skip ahead or go to another scene. Maybe you want to have one scene for each of these actions so that you can deal with the player being particularly negative. It's so powerful what you can do. There's so many different things. But if you saw on this start greeting scene, I showed you guys that there's the scene thing. You also have that on any of these lines. So you can actually do select a scene. Now there's one thing to know with that. And again, this is stuff I'll cover in more detail in individual tutorials. I'm just trying to give you guys some things to get your minds reeling about potential you could do. But you could select the scene from here. Just one thing that's different when you do it on non-greetings is you want to make sure you hit start scene on end. For whatever reason, greetings are treated differently. They will actually finish the greeting before they start the scene, but anywhere else you use this system, it happens immediately unless you check in this little box. So just a little handy helper moment there, because if you start experimenting, you're 100% going to run into that and not know how to fix it. So I think the last thing we have to do now is find our player lines and get those exported. And I'm going to pause now and go find some and come back so you guys don't have to wait for me to listen to a bunch of player dialogue. All right, so quick tour through voice file reference tool, and I've got all of our lines figured out here. So I'm going to show you guys some things we can do in voice file reference. I'm going to show you quickly something we can do with it that was really useful is when you start searching for the line, if you find the one you want, you can just hit copy dialogue and it just copies the text. So I was able to just quickly paste those into these. But we're going to go through and I'm going to actually go through the extraction process of how you do this for player dialogue. So I went ahead and just copied the lines in just to make it quicker to find them again. So and I set up the facial animations. So rather than hitting each of the voice things and hitting record, we don't want our own voice, we want the player's voice. We're going to rely on voice file reference tool. So there's a couple things we're going to do here. First, we're going to bring up this here. So there's a bunch of different versions of this.
You're
Let's
right.
see which one
I'm sorry. You're right. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I like that one. Fine. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to grab this voice file name. So we're going to copy this. Now keep in mind this is the same. You'll notice that there's two voice types here and only one voice file name. That's because the actual file name will be the same for each voice type, and then it will just go into a subfolder for that voice type. And this is all handled for you automatically, even by voice file reference tool. So it's really cool. But we find the one we want. We're going to right click and hit extract. And we're going to select it here. I'm going to make sure this is on PCM Wave Audio, and I uncheck this, and I explain all of this stuff in the tutorial about the voice file reference tool if you want more information on that. And we're going to paste this in here, hit rename, and then hit extract. And then we're going to go ahead and click on voice mail, and you'll see that the search stays, which is really awesome, so that I can just do the same thing. I can either grab the exact same file name, or I can listen to these real quick.
I'm sorry. You're right. I'm sorry. You're right.
Well,
I'm sorry.
There we go. A little less serious. Grab this one, paste that in, hit rename, hit extract. And these end up in a folder here. Oops, and I have this one from earlier. But they end up in folders here. So inside of the voice file reference tool folder, there's an extracted files. It will put it into a folder that matches the ESM where they came from, and then the voice file types. So what you can end up doing is once you've got all of these done, you can just grab these folders and move them into the directory where your sound files are for your plugin, which I'll show you that after I finish this. But let's go ahead and knock out the rest of these just so you guys get used to the workflow. Hit OK here, and let's do the next one. Let's see. We'll grab this file name. Oh, I wanted to grab this first. It's none of your damn business. And then go back up in here and get this file name. Here we go. So I've already listened to this one. I'm happy with it. Rename, extract. Do the same for female. So, oops. And watch out when you do that. If you click on this, is really obnoxious. If you click on the name right here, it ends up putting that replace there, and then it screws up the rename. And so whenever that happens, I just back out again. well, to me, this is a bug in the software, but the author seems to have moved on. I've messaged them in the past and I haven't heard anything back. So let's extract this. And then we'll keep going back through here. We got just 2 more to do. But what I tend to do when I'm having to do this is I will first just go, usually, I work with writers generally, so they'll have figured all this out. But when I'm doing this part of the workflow, I tend to implement everything except for this files. And then I'll just sit down and have a session where this is all I'm doing is messing with this, because this can get pretty tedious if you're jumping back and forth between, like, you can really get hard to get into a flow state if you're having to jump, you're doing all this scene work and then you have to keep messing with this other tool. Personally, I like to get all the scene work done, get it all tested, and then come back in and do all this extraction and whatnot. And you could do that where you just temporarily record your own voice for those files. That's a little quicker and keeps you in the CK, so you're not breaking your flow. But everybody knows, you all know your own workflows and what derails you. Get those things out of the way, because that's the only way you're going to get any real mod work done. You can get all those distractions and workflow problems out of the way, because it's very time consuming to mod. So anything you can do to speed that up is worth it. Let's paste this guy. And then our last one is, what are you talking about? Grab this. Oh, I keep forgetting to do this part. It's been a while since I've had to do this. Let's see. Oh, Jesus, I'm screwing up my own workflow. Double copy pasting unnecessarily. Let's see here. Which one do we like?
What are you talking about? What are you talking about?
There we go. Mass confusion. I like that one. Let's see if the male has a similar.
What are you talking about?
Yep. I like that one. Rename, extract. And then I like to go in here and just double check that I have the correct amount of files I'm expecting. So 4 for the male, or 4 for the female, 4 for the male. Because once in a while I'll forget to do one sex or the other. That is miserable when you forget that, because figuring out which one is which, as you can tell, is very difficult. Given the way the files are named, like trying to figure, you can figure it out. I could just compare those 2 directories and see which I missed, but finding the actual file name to go correctly find the right line again requires me to open each of these in the CK again and go all the way down to the screen to get the voice file name. Again, that's another benefit of outside of flow state, if that's not something you concern yourself with, just making sure that you have a set of steps that are minimal so that you're not forgetting steps, because this is a miserable one to forget. All right, so we've got those all set up there. I recorded all of my lines. So the last thing we need to do is the lip sync stuff. I've shown a tutorial on that, so I'm going to just do that off camera, and I will see you back in game, and we can walk through this quick little conversation. Okay, so I was going to jump in game, then I remembered I was going to show you guys something, and I'm glad that I did, because something happened that will happen to you guys occasionally, and I just wanted you guys to be aware of it. So I was going to show you to take the files from the voice file reference to the player voice, and I'm going to just cut and paste those into here. But then before I do that, I realized that there was a problem. So you can see there's all these folders, which to me was very confusing because I didn't record voices for those. Well, this is something I'm just learning today, is that if those moments happen, excuse me, where I showed you where it had the wrong voice types listed, where let's bring that back up just so I'm making sure I'm talking about the right thing here. When you came to this screen and you went to record and it had like a whole bunch of voice types listed here, apparently, even when that's not happening, occasionally it will record and put a copy in a folder for each of the different voice types. So the same 2 files are in every one of these folders. So keep an eye on that if that happens. Just get rid of these. You don't want to include these with your mod. It's going to bloat your mod for no reason. It doesn't hurt anything for them to be there otherwise. But I'm going to just delete all of these folders here. I don't want these included, and get those out of there. There we go. So now, come on. I don't know. We're worried about hard drive trouble here now all of a sudden. Now I'm going to cut these and paste those in. So they go inside of, and you would learn this in the very first dialog tutorial, but just to follow it up. Follow for data, sound, voice, and then there's a folder named exactly after your mod file. So if it's .esp, ESM, ESL, it will have that in the name up here. Now, if you are doing another advanced little tip, if you are doing something like I do with some settlements, the file is in release is named .esm, but when I'm working in the CK, I have to change it back to an ESP. And what will end up happening is while I'm working on the files, they get put in an ESP folder. And then when I convert the files for testing, I end up having to come back in here and remember to rename the voice folder as well. So keep that in mind, is that it's always going to match exactly your file name. So the same thing would happen if you opted to rename your mod file. You got to remember to come back and rename your voice file, your voice folder as well. All right, now we can go in game. All right, so here's our NPCs where we left them from the Dialogue 101 tutorial. Before we do this, I want to point out a couple of things that you're going to see here. One is that the sound volume from the player versus the voice files I recorded is way off. And this is something I mentioned in Dialogue 101. You're never going to want to use that CK recorded dialogue as final dialogue. That should always be your test dialogue with the intent, which you should always have the intention of going back in and doing your voice recording in a proper piece of software where you can normalize the volume to what the Bethesda volume is. And that's the sort of thing, well, I think is worth a tutorial in its own of showing you guys how to do a minor audio editing and at least how to balance your audio so the normalization is the same as the base game so your stuff will fit in nicely with it. And this is not done. That obviously I recorded that in the CK. Another thing I want you guys to pay attention to is the lip syncing. It's actually surprisingly good, and you can get a feel for some of the facial animations since I set them up for all of the lines, so you can see how they're subtly tweaking the face. And then the last thing I wanted to point out is we didn't get into forcing the dialogue camera, so you'll notice the initial interaction, there's no dialogue camera, and I will show that eventually, but a caveat to that is with greetings, and this is another reason to do short greetings, is you can't actually force a dialogue cam in a greeting, but there's a trick around that, and again, I'll show you that in some other tutorial. So these are just some little things that some of you guys might be thinking about when you watch this, and just wanted to bring them up ahead of time. So we'll walk up and...
Hey, how's it going?
Because we don't have...
Wait a second, aren't you the one who stole my wrench?
Since we don't have force player activation, the... NPC starts the conversation as soon as we approach them. If we wanted to make sure the player had to talk to them, we could set force on. And then you can see sarcastic is already grayed out because I tested it before I hit record because I was worried that I made a mistake with some of the sound files. And actually, I had on a previous recording, I had forgot to record one of the lines that I waited to add until after I set up the player lines. So,
What's the going price on these tools again?
Sarcasm, eh? The lowest form. So you do have it.
But if you saw during that lowest form of something something, I intentionally mumbled, and the lip sync actually got it, which was impressive. Now, I guess one more thing to mention here is that this scene, the way that I just set that up, it's going to keep repeating every time I get close to him. After I think it resets after 30 seconds, something like that, where he's just going to start talking to me again. Here we go.
Wait a second, aren't you the one who stole my wrench?
So keep that in mind. The conditioning, which I talked about a lot in Dialogue 103, is that if you're going to set up scenes like this with greetings, you want to condition them and make sure there's some method, you know what, you set a quest stage or a global or something to make sure they can't repeat these more and more unless you want them to. So keep that in mind that they are going to just keep doing it.
What are you talking about?
We'll go ahead and do another one.
That wrench you have looks exactly
But yeah,
like
you can see the
one.
volume difference is pretty substantial. So
You know what?
you definitely want to record those files elsewhere. Or I mean, I guess you could take the CK ones and just edit them. I guess that's possible too. So if you get yourself a performance you really loved in the CK, my bet though is that the wave file quality picked up in the CK is lower. I can't, maybe not though. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they record it in as high a quality as your computer's capable
aren't
of.
you the one who stole my
not really
wrench?
positive of that. All right, that's enough. That's enough gaff. All right, guys. Stay tuned for, I think the next episode, we're probably going to tie this into the quest making. So if you have been following the quest making, or if you haven't yet and you're interested in making fully voiced quests and you want to have, quest givers giving out the quests, definitely go catch up on my quest makers section of this particular, or of Bethesda Mod School. And likely I will take the information from this exact tutorial and some of the information in that quest making series, combine them together and walk you through making a quest where the NPC gives you the quest and the reward. So that'll likely be our next tutorial.